Senator, you indicated your background as Native American on your professional registration with your own pen. The nation's leader articulated, hoisting a magnified, protective-coated reproduction, recognizing from years of public life that visual materials serve as undeniable visual proof for even the most distant viewers. And he deliberately gestured to the specific line where the official had, decades earlier, in distinct azure ink, with the meticulous script of an emerging legal scholar at the University of Texas, inscribed those exact identifying words in the demographic section. The tribal administration had previously requested a cessation of such claims. You subsequently underwent a genetic analysis which suggested a heritage proportion smaller than the national average, and you had previously submitted culinary instructions to a community collection titled Pow Wow Chow, which contained elements found in pre-existing publications. He paused, a deliberate and calculated suspension of speech, as his pauses were perpetually intentional, reflecting the seasoned instinct of a public figure who had spent half a century navigating camera lenses and understood that the quiet anticipation preceding a crucial remark often held more gravity than the remark itself. I have participated in numerous endeavors throughout my journey, some commendable and others less so. Yet, I have never adopted a different background to secure a prestigious academic appointment. That remains your unique legacy, Senator, not mine. The gathered spectators erupted, not with the predictable partisan fervor of a standard political rally, but with the complex resonance of a widely broadcast civic forum, complete with an impartial moderator, a meticulously divided attendance, and comprehensive media coverage. This was the sudden outburst of 400 individuals who had just absorbed a statement they perceived as strikingly candid and uncomfortably sharp, momentarily suspended as they determined which emotional response to prioritize. The senator remained stationed at her designated position a short distance away, and for a remarkably protracted span, subsequently timed by media analysts at precisely 2.4 seconds, a seeming eternity in the realm of live broadcasting, she refrained from speaking. Her facial expression settled into the familiar, resolute configuration she had maintained throughout countless legislative proceedings and 1,000 media appearances. The tightened, unwavering demeanor of a professional preparing to deliver a formidable counter-argument. However, the anticipated verbal defense did not materialize within those crucial 2.4 seconds. And in the unforgiving arena of televised debates, 4 seconds of silence from a representative renowned for her vocal advocacy inadvertently became the defining narrative. That singular hesitation transformed into the defining sequence, destined to be extracted and rebroadcast over 110 million times across various platforms. Yet, this high-stakes encounter had commenced 90 minutes earlier, initiating precisely according to the senator's strategic design, anchored firmly in substantive legislative matters. The civic dialogue had been her initiative, a crucial detail to comprehend because it implied that the ensuing events were, from a strategic standpoint, a consequence of her own framework. It was akin to a grandmaster in chess challenging a seasoned pugilist to a confrontation within a boxing arena, constituting a tactical miscalculation irrespective of her profound mastery of her own discipline. She had invited the chief executive to an open discussion concerning consumer safeguards in March 2026, during the height of a fierce legislative struggle over the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This regulatory body, which she had originally conceptualized during her tenure in academia, fiercely championed through Congress, and meticulously constructed from its foundation as a specialized counselor to President Obama, had been staunchly defended against numerous ideological challenges for 15 years. Now, however, it faced systematic restructuring under the current administration's directives. The acting administrator, Russell Vought, had suspended the organization's primary functions, and prominent technology figures had publicly signaled the agency's perceived demise on digital networks. Operating as the ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee, the senator was spearheading the resistance. She desired a prominent platform and widespread visibility. She aimed for the national populace to witness a direct engagement with the leadership, illustrating precisely what protections were being rescinded and identifying the responsible parties. On this particular subject, her intellect was exceptional. She grasped the intricacies of personal finance regulations with a depth unparalleled by most contemporary public servants, possessing the unique capacity to distill convoluted regulatory frameworks into accessible concepts that everyday citizens managing their personal checking accounts could readily comprehend and value. What she seemingly failed to fully internalize, despite a decade of observable patterns, was the reality that her opponent did not engage in conflicts according to her preferred academic parameters. He did not debate abstract policies. He engaged directly with personalities. When his counterpart possessed a vulnerability as deeply entrenched and publicly documented as the one this particular senator harbored, the minutiae of policy became entirely secondary. The vulnerability itself transformed into the primary spectacle. The invitation to debate had been accepted within an hour, accompanied by a succinct, single-sentence declaration, expressing a willingness to debate the individual he referred to, using a controversial historical moniker, anytime, anywhere, and on any subject, provided she utilized what he deemed her authentic identity. The event was organized in April at a convention center in Philadelphia, serving as a neutral location within a highly competitive swing state, a metropolitan area where both figures possessed historical ties. CNN moderated the proceedings, curating an audience of 400 individuals evenly distributed between registered Democrats and Republicans selected by the network. The format entailed 90 minutes of alternating inquiries from the facilitator and the attendees, featuring 2-minute allocation periods for primary responses and subsequent 1-minute intervals for rebuttals. The senator arrived accompanied by a cadre of legislative specialists, a comprehensive compilation of agency statistics, and the well-founded assurance of a professional who had previously deconstructed the arguments of major corporate executives during rigorous committee reviews with surgical precision and unwavering moral conviction. She had anticipated every conceivable policy-related inquiry the administration might encounter, and she had practiced counter-arguments for expected criticisms. According to a subsequent disclosure from a campaign associate, she had meticulously prepared for virtually every potential trajectory, except the specific scenario that ultimately unfolded. Her opponent arrived without any supplementary materials, approaching his designated area with his characteristic forward-leaning posture, projecting the demeanor of an individual who presumed ownership of the venue and was merely tolerating the presence of guests. He calibrated his audio equipment, surveyed the gathered crowd, directed his gaze toward his opponent, and offered a slight, knowing smile, greeting her simply as a professor. She refrained from engaging with the initial provocation, having been correctly counseled that reacting to such tactics would only amplify them, and instead directed her attention toward the facilitator prepared for the opening inquiry. The initial question pertained directly to the Consumer Protection Agency, a topic she had extensively rehearsed. She commenced her response, her tone carrying the undeniable authority of the architect who had quite literally designed the institution in question. She articulated that the Bureau had successfully restored an excess of $21 billion to working households that had experienced unfair practices by major financial institutions and expansive corporate entities. She detailed how it had successfully restricted excessive banking penalties, implemented boundaries on delayed payment charges, and systematically eliminated health-related debts from personal financial evaluations. She asserted that the current leadership was attempting to dismantle the organization not due to any operational failure, but rather because of its undeniable success in mandating accountability from influential entities, noting that powerful interests inherently resist such oversight. The response was robust, deeply substantive, exceptionally clear, and carried a profound emotional resonance. It was the exact caliber of articulation that, within a legislative chamber, would have served as the authoritative conclusion on the matter. Her opponent received 2 minutes to formulate his counter-statement. He allocated merely 8 seconds of that duration to address the agency directly, characterizing it as an unelected governmental entity operating without adequate oversight. He emphasized its funding mechanism through the Federal Reserve rather than traditional congressional appropriations, asserting that it generated restrictive mandates that disproportionately burdened smaller commercial enterprises without a viable mechanism for intervention. He employed a colorful metaphor, labeling the agency a bureaucratic pest and designating himself as the necessary remedy. A wave of amusement swept through the venue, while the senator's supporters maintained a solemn demeanor. The sound of laughter was undeniably present, and within a space occupied by 400 individuals and 40 recording devices, such a collective reaction fundamentally alters the conversational atmosphere, much like a sudden atmospheric shift preceding a storm. He quickly pivoted, stating his reluctance to dedicate the evening to discussing the agency, acknowledging her instrumental role in its creation and her protective instincts over it. Instead, he declared his intention to focus on a broader, more fundamental concept: authenticity. He reasoned that since she frequently emphasized the importance of holding powerful individuals accountable, that very standard should logically be applied to her own record. It was at this juncture that he retrieved the protective coded document from his podium, identifying it as a professional registration document for the State Bar of Texas, dated April 18th, 1986. He noted it had been completed by the senator during her tenure as a legal educator, drawing specific attention to the demographic section where she had manually inscribed the 2 identifying words. As he displayed the document, the senator's expression remained perfectly composed. She had anticipated this specific line of inquiry, had readied herself for it, and had practiced a response designed to acknowledge the historical misstep before skillfully redirecting the dialogue back to substantive legislative matters. However, the inherent flaw in such preparation is the assumption that the confrontation will materialize exactly as envisioned during rehearsals. She had braced for a solemn, severe accusation, whereas her opponent instead delivered an expertly timed rhetorical setup. He expressed a desire to remain equitable, acknowledging her public statements that her family, specifically her maternal relatives, had relayed narratives regarding Native American ancestry. He expressed a willingness to believe that she had indeed been told such stories, drawing a parallel to his own familial anecdotes where he was assured of his unparalleled attractiveness during his youth in Queens, noting humorously that he refrained from recording such subjective compliments on his official professional documents. The resulting laughter was notably more robust this time. It was not merely the polite acknowledgement of a mildly clever remark, but rather the spontaneous, irrepressible reaction to an unexpected and sharply observational statement, the kind of laughter that escapes before the conscious filter can evaluate its appropriateness. He continued his progression, indicating that the singular registration document was merely one component of a broader pattern. He announced his intention to outline the historical sequence, suggesting that since traditional media outlets might neglect the comprehensive timeline, he felt compelled to provide it. At this moment, he executed a rhetorical strategy that surprised even his closest observers. He became exceptionally methodical, adopting a sequential rhythm reminiscent of a seasoned performer navigating a carefully curated setlist, ensuring each data point served dual purposes as both factual evidence and a rhetorical strike. He began with 1984, detailing her contribution of culinary instructions to a community collection, emphasizing the publication's title, Pow Wow Chow, and assuring the audience he was not fabricating the name. He noted the collection purported to feature contributions from historical tribal families and that she had identified herself within its pages as possessing specific tribal heritage. He allowed the title of the publication to linger in the air for a moment, allowing the phrase to accomplish its own communicative work. Moving to 1986, he highlighted the handwritten demographic identification on her Texas professional registration, ensuring the audience understood it was her own penmanship and not that of an assistant. He then spanned the 9 years from 1986 to 1995, noting her continuous inclusion in an academic directory utilized by institutions seeking to recruit minority faculty members, emphasizing that for nearly a decade she maintained that specific categorization. Progressing to 1989, he referenced an alteration of her demographic profile at the University of Pennsylvania, transitioning from a majority classification to a Native American designation, comparing the simplicity of the alteration to modifying a digital streaming password. He concluded the historical review with her tenure at Harvard Law School from 1995 to 2004, highlighting that the institution included her in their federal demographic reporting metrics as a minority faculty member. He quoted a prominent student publication from 1996, wherein an institutional representative explicitly affirmed her Native American background. He lowered the document, asserting that such a sustained pattern transcended mere family folklore, characterizing it instead as a 20-year professional trajectory of claiming a specific marginalized identity on official documents utilized for employment and federal compliance. He further critiqued her subsequent response upon public disclosure of these records in 2012 by the Boston Globe, noting a lack of immediate contrition and a reliance on familial narratives, coupled with assertions that the classification yielded no professional advantages. He then arrived at what he framed as the culmination of the narrative, her 2018 decision to undergo genetic testing to definitively address the controversy. He smiled, an expression characteristic of a narrator approaching a highly anticipated conclusion he had savored for 8 years. He described the elaborate rollout of the results, involving prominent academic verification and professional documentation, only to reveal an exceptionally distant ancestral connection estimated between 6 and 10 generations prior. He contextualized this temporal distance, translating it to approximately 200 to 300 years, landing around the year 1750, resulting in a genetic proportion ranging from 1/64 to 1/124. He provided comparative context, asserting that the average citizen of European descent within the nation possesses a significantly higher percentage of such genetic markers. He engaged directly with an audience member in the third row, humorously suggesting that the randomly selected individual might possess stronger ancestral claims than the senator without receiving any controversial historical monikers. The resulting amusement cascaded through the auditorium, expanding from its origin point until it enveloped the entire venue. He then referenced the formal declaration issued by the actual sovereign tribal nation she had referenced, quoting their statement, which explicitly condemned the use of genetic analysis to establish tribal affiliation as fundamentally inappropriate and misguided. He emphasized that these critical evaluations originated not from adversarial media networks, but directly from the recognized representatives of the community in question, concluding that when the legitimate community actively disputes the claim is inherently invalid. The facilitator subsequently provided the senator with an opportunity for rebuttal. She grasped the audio equipment with the disciplined intensity of a professional who recognized the detrimental impact of prolonged silence. She addressed the executive directly, stating that she had issued public, repeated, and direct apologies to the tribal community regarding the misunderstanding her actions had generated. She acknowledged the error in utilizing that specific identification and the misjudgment in pursuing the genetic analysis, emphasizing the sincerity of her prior concessions. However, she swiftly transitioned to clarify a critical aspect of the controversy. She referenced a comprehensive investigation conducted by a major regional publication which had uncovered definitive evidence demonstrating that her demographic categorization was never a factor in her academic recruitment processes. She asserted that every colleague involved in those evaluations had corroborated this finding, firmly stating she derived no professional advancement from the identification. Turning her attention to the audience, she highlighted a stark contrast. While her opponent focused intensely on a 40-year-old registration document, he had notably avoided discussing the $21 billion his administration was effectively withholding from everyday consumers by dismantling the protective agency. She criticized his silence regarding increased banking penalties and the exploitation of vulnerable demographics by predatory lending institutions, suggesting he preferred discussing a historical culinary publication precisely because he wished to avoid defending the ongoing destruction of a vital regulatory body in 2026. This counter-argument was structurally sound, directly addressing accountability while effectively returning the focus to her core legislative strengths. Political analysts would undoubtedly rate it as a highly proficient debate maneuver. Her opponent offered a slow, appreciative gesture of acknowledgement, projecting the demeanor of someone receiving exactly what they had anticipated. He praised her delivery, but immediately circled back to her assertion regarding the absence of professional benefit. He conceded the media investigation's findings regarding the hiring committee's awareness, but highlighted the subsequent reality. For 9 years, the academic institution formally reported her to federal authorities as a minority faculty member. He argued that this action inherently benefited the institution by improving their diversity metrics, and she was the instrument of that benefit. Fully aware of the categorization, he then smoothly transitioned back to the topic of the culinary publication, gently dismissing the facilitator's attempt to initiate the audience participation segment. He reiterated the title of the community cookbook, emphasizing that she had submitted 5 recipes under a specific tribal designation. He implored the audience to fully comprehend the situation. A distinguished national legislator, a key figure on financial oversight committees, and a former presidential contender had contributed to this specific publication, and independent reviews had subsequently revealed that at least one of her submissions, a cold seafood dish, was substantially identical to material previously published elsewhere. He framed this not just as a misrepresentation of identity, but as a lack of originality in her culinary contributions. He shook his head with an exaggerated sense of disbelief, suggesting that such a narrative would be rejected by fictional entertainment producers as overly contrived. He summarized the sequence of events: the initial identity claim, the prolonged inclusion in diversity metrics, the submission of unoriginal recipes to a culturally specific publication, the contradictory genetic analysis, the official tribal condemnation, the subsequent apologies, and her ultimate electoral performance in her home state of Massachusetts during a presidential primary. He directly questioned her regarding that electoral outcome, asking how a prominent figure from a supportive demographic region could finish in a subordinate third position behind other national figures within her own constituency, comparing it to an improbable failure in his own area of commercial expertise. She wisely opted not to engage directly with this specific political taunt, adhering to the sound advice that descending into personal political grievances would dilute her policy-focused message. She attempted to recenter the discourse, asserting that the viewing public was significantly less concerned with a historical publication from 1984 than they were with the prospect of facing deceptive practices from financial institutions. Her opponent immediately interjected, countering that the public was deeply invested in the fundamental honesty of those who presume to lecture them on integrity, asserting that her long-term actions demonstrated a severe deficit in that very quality. The facilitator intervened to formally commence the audience interaction phase. An attendee located in the fourth row, identified as an independent commercial operator from a vital suburban district, representing the precise demographic both political camps were aggressively pursuing, presented an inquiry regarding transaction processing charges and the protective agency's capacity to regulate them. The senator's response was masterful. This was her specialized domain. The practical, everyday economic realities faced by households attempting to manage financial obligations, while institutions subtly altered the terms of agreement. She referenced precise enforcement initiatives undertaken by the agency, identified the specific offending corporations, and detailed the exact financial restitution provided to affected citizens. Her delivery combined the fluid expertise of a seasoned academic who had dedicated 20 years to the subject, with the profound empathy of an advocate who comprehensively understood from research the deep frustration associated with unexpected and unauthorized financial penalties. The attendee signaled agreement, and the entire audience remained remarkably attentive, demonstrating the rare capacity of deeply substantive policy discussions to command respect. Even in environments typically dominated by performative conflict, her opponent was granted a rebuttal period. He acknowledged the validity of the attendee's concern, agreeing that transaction costs were excessively high. He distinguished their approaches by outlining their divergent solutions. He characterized the senator's method as reliant upon an insulated, unelected bureaucracy, imposing mandates upon commercial entities without democratic oversight. In contrast, he advocated for market competition and legislative intervention, arguing that when markets fail, the elected representatives directly chosen by the populace should enact remedies rather than an autonomous agency funded outside the standard congressional appropriation process. By his standard metrics, this constituted a substantive policy articulation, though it occupied merely 9 seconds of his allotted time. He immediately pivoted back to the senator's previous assertion regarding the public's lack of interest in the historical cookbook. He respectfully challenged her premise, questioning precisely which segments of the public she was referring to. He suggested that the academic administrators who utilized her demographic status, the institutional record keepers who modified her classifications, and most importantly, the hundreds of tribal citizens who formally petitioned her to cease utilizing their heritage, cared profoundly about the matter. He turned his focus entirely to the audience, emphasizing a crucial perspective he felt was frequently overlooked. He spoke of the actual indigenous populations residing within the nation, specific tribal communities, individuals living on designated lands, descendants of those subjected to historical educational assimilation programs and forced relocations. He contrasted their lived realities with her actions, stating that for 20 years, an affluent, highly educated individual from a different background had adopted their identity on official documentation. He argued this was not done out of shared cultural experience or geographic proximity, but based on a distant familial narrative, which she deemed sufficient justification to claim official minority status. He explicitly categorized this behavior as cultural appropriation, criticizing ideological counterparts for selectively applying this concept while excusing similar actions within their own ranks. The audience's reaction was notably complex. Vocal approval emanated from certain sections, while uncomfortable silence settled over others, reflecting the cognitive dissonance of individuals processing a compelling argument they were ideologically predisposed to reject. The senator responded with heightened acuity, projecting the disciplined frustration of an accomplished professional being unfairly reduced to a singular historical misjudgment, acutely aware of the disparity between her comprehensive record and the immediate rhetorical landscape. She addressed the executive, reiterating her acceptance of responsibility and her previous apologies to the affected communities. She firmly stated her acknowledgement that she does not belong to a marginalized demographic or a sovereign tribal nation, owning her mistake completely. However, she pivoted to deliver a sharp, highly effective counter-critique. She refused to accept lectures regarding cultural sensitivity from an individual who had previously utilized a controversial historical moniker during a formal executive ceremony designed to honor indigenous military communications specialists. She vividly recalled the event, where veterans who had risked their lives utilizing their sacred linguistic traditions as vital strategic codes stood directly behind him, while he employed a culturally sensitive term as a casual political jest. She accused him of weaponizing the very heritage he now purported to defend merely to disparage a political rival. The supportive sections of the audience reacted with vigorous approval. It was undeniably her most forceful maneuver of the night. Precise, heavily critical, and historically accurate. He had indeed utilized the controversial nickname during a highly publicized November 2017 White House event honoring veterans, prompting immediate and severe condemnation from national indigenous organizations who characterized it as a reflection of profound insensitivity. For a brief 30-second interval, the power dynamics within the venue fundamentally shifted. She had successfully redirected the controversy back toward his own documented transgressions, placing him momentarily on the defensive. The atmosphere grew thick with anticipation as observers waited to see if the individual who had spent the evening scrutinizing her historical documentation would acknowledge his own well-documented failure to demonstrate appropriate respect. He absorbed the critique without displaying any physical reaction. He offered no apology. Instead, he executed a calculated pivot. He affirmed the heroic status of the veterans, noting his role in honoring them at the executive residence. He conceded the use of an inappropriate term during the event, granting her the validity of that specific criticism. However, he immediately drew a stark contrast, arguing that while he had experienced a momentary lapse in judgment regarding terminology, she had maintained a fabricated professional identity for 20 years, across numerous legal and academic documents. He juxtaposed a singular, regrettable instance against what he characterized as a prolonged, strategic career maneuver. The facilitator transitioned to the next public inquiry. Presented by an individual from a working-class urban neighborhood concerning the expanding economic disparity and the respective strategies for addressing the concentration of resources among the wealthiest 1%. The senator seized the opportunity, delivering an exceptional response. She drew upon her extensive 20-year background in insolvency regulations, explaining that her comprehensive research on thousands of financially distressed families revealed a consistent pattern. These individuals were not irresponsible. They were ordinary, hard-working families who encountered unexpected medical crises, employment terminations, or marital dissolutions. She painted a picture of a middle class constantly teetering on the edge of financial ruin, facing a systemic architecture, banking, credit, and insurance sectors intentionally structured to capitalize on their vulnerabilities. She positioned this systemic inequity as the genesis of her protective agency and the rationale behind her proposed levy on extreme wealth. detailing the specific parameters of a 2-cent surcharge on fortunes exceeding $50 million. She passionately outlined the transformative societal benefits this revenue could generate: comprehensive early childhood education, widespread debt relief for 43 million citizens, and sustained infrastructural investments. She framed these proposals not as radical ideology, but as basic arithmetic. It was a quintessential demonstration of her core political identity: deeply substantive, profoundly compassionate, rooted in empirical data, and articulated with a quiet, undeniable intensity that her dedicated supporters universally recognized and admired. Her opponent's counter was remarkably brief and devastatingly targeted. He stated a precise estimate of her personal financial net worth, placing it at $12 million. He allowed the substantial figure to resonate before elaborating on her significant residential holdings, specifically a $3 million estate in an exclusive academic enclave, and her history of occupying highly compensated, prestigious positions. He highlighted the juxtaposition of her authoring publications concerning middle-class struggles from a position of profound financial security, noting that the working-class individuals she claimed to champion could scarcely afford the basic costs of navigating her neighborhood. He acknowledged his own extraordinary wealth, emphasizing that his distinction lay in his transparency. He argued that he never attempted to feign an understanding of the working-class struggle. Rather, he presented himself as an insider who understood the system's mechanics and possessed the capacity to reform it. He characterized her relatable, every-woman persona as a carefully curated narrative, an artificial construct that was increasingly losing its efficacy. He listed her numerous detailed policy proposals covering healthcare, education, environmental strategy, and childcare, repeating the word plan to emphasize the sheer volume of her academic frameworks. He then delivered the critical blow, asserting that despite her abundance of theoretical structures, she lacked the practical capacity to implement them, pointing again to her subordinate finish in her own state's primary elections as evidence of her inability to translate theory into successful execution. He contrasted her identity as an academic theorist with his own self-proclaimed identity as a practical builder and negotiator, grudgingly acknowledging her creation of the consumer agency while simultaneously disparaging its utility and operational structure. He reiterated his characterization of the agency as an unaccountable, burdensome entity, and noted a perceived slight from the former administration, suggesting she had been passed over for its directorship because even her ideological allies considered her too controversial, framing her subsequent legislative career as a mere consolation prize. He challenged her metric of success, questioning the uncalculated costs imposed upon small commercial operations, struggling to comply with complex new regulations, arguing that while theorists focus solely on positive outcomes, practical operators must account for the total balance sheet. The senator requested and received permission for a subsequent rebuttal. She began by unexpectedly acknowledging a point of agreement, stating that the executive was correct in one specific regard. This rare instance of concurrence commanded immediate silence. She proudly affirmed her possession of detailed strategies to regulate vital medical costs, alleviate educational debt, and ensure equitable contributions from the ultra-wealthy. She forcefully articulated the reason these strategies remained unfulfilled: persistent obstruction from his political faction, driven not by the inherent flaws of the proposals, but by the threat they posed to their affluent benefactors. She justified her comprehensive planning by referencing her life's work, analyzing the systemic pressures crushing working households. She concluded with a powerful declaration, stating her preference for a leader who is mocked for possessing detailed solutions over one who lacks strategies, core values, and any focus beyond personal self-aggrandizement. In a standard political environment, this would have been the defining moment, the central narrative of the subsequent news cycle. Her opponent waited for the approving reactions to subside before offering a patronizingly positive assessment of her delivery, assigning it a high academic grade while gently mocking her reliance on familiar rhetorical phrases. Then, the atmosphere shifted once more. He returned to the central theme, suggesting that her passionate rhetoric regarding integrity and systemic fairness was fundamentally compromised by the foundational misrepresentation of her career. He meticulously recounted the timeline once again: the handwritten registration, the academic directories, the culinary publication, the contradictory genetic analysis, and the formal tribal denunciation involving 200 signatures. He modulated his vocal delivery, dropping into a rare, quiet, almost conversational tone. He acknowledged the numerous pejorative labels applied to him throughout his career, conceding the potential validity of some, but firmly established a boundary he claimed never to have crossed. He had never adopted a marginalized identity to facilitate professional advancement. He asserted he had never appropriated the profound historical trauma of indigenous communities for personal administrative benefit. The venue fell completely silent. He contrasted the daily struggles of working-class citizens in post-industrial regions, individuals lacking the luxury of utilizing such demographic classifications for advancement or the resilience to survive a failed genetic verification or the comfort of multi-million-dollar estates with her privileged position. He argued these citizens possessed an inherent ability to detect fundamental dishonesty. After a strategic pause, he delivered the final, resonant statement. He asserted that the controversial historical nickname was not his invention, but rather an identity she had essentially assigned to herself the moment she formalized her demographic claim on that legal document decades prior. The formal proceedings concluded 11 minutes later, following a final, largely forgotten exchange regarding medical policy. The event terminated at 9:41 p.m., with a customary gesture of professional courtesy, which the executive accepted with the visible satisfaction of a perceived victor. The senator departed immediately, her transportation securing an expedited exit, while her counterpart remained on the floor for an extended two-minute period, engaging with supporters, signing memorabilia, and repeatedly emphasizing the name of the culinary publication to various groups, ensuring the phrase permeated the post-event environment. The dissemination of the evening's events was drastically imbalanced. The brief one-two-word critique, delivered during that moment of uncharacteristic quiet, accumulated over 110 million views within 4 days, becoming the defining political interaction of 2026. Conversely, the senator's rigorous, substantive defense of the consumer agency, though objectively stronger and significantly more relevant to the material conditions of the populace, received barely 1.2 million views on video platforms and garnered respectful but limited attention in specialized political publications. This asymmetry was the defining narrative. The disparity between comprehensive policy articulation and compelling entertainment had long been a feature of the political landscape. But the magnitude of this specific divergence was unprecedented. Her most articulate defense of working-class struggles received approximately 1% of the audience that engaged with the visual of the magnified registration document. Her official subsequent communication appropriately highlighted the executive's reliance on personal attacks over substantive defense of his regulatory dismantlement, yet this responsible statement failed to gain any significant digital traction. Professional analysis followed predictable patterns. Progressive commentators lauded her command of the issues and criticized the hostile nature of the engagement, while conservative observers praised the effective deconstruction of her political persona. Neutral analysts simply noted the obvious. She had dominated the technical debate, but he had mastered the public spectacle, and the spectacle was ultimately the only element that resonated with the broader public. Viewership metrics confirmed the massive interest in the event, drawing 28.7 million viewers, setting records for non-election programming. Crucially, focus group evaluations revealed a devastating reality for the senator. While she scored highly on metrics of knowledge and preparation, her opponent outpaced her in perceived authenticity, entertainment value, and, most damagingly, honesty. The individual who had dedicated her professional life to challenging deceptive institutional practices was perceived as less honest than a figure renowned for his flexible relationship with factual accuracy. This was not because he was objectively more truthful, but because the specific nature of her historical demographic claim created a singular, easily understandable narrative of misrepresentation that adhered to her public profile in a way his numerous, varied controversies did not. He inherently understood that a multitude of standard political exaggerations register as mere statistics, whereas a specific, tangible fabrication regarding personal identity functions as a compelling story. Her vulnerability was not her policy platform. It was the foundation of her authentic connection with the electorate. Her entire public identity rested on the premise of being a relatable advocate for the common citizen. The revelation that she had utilized a marginalized identity on official documents, participated in a culturally specific publication with unoriginal material, and attempted to validate the claim through controversial genetic testing, fundamentally fractured that premise. Even her sincere apologies were perceived as reactive damage control rather than proactive contrition. Her opponent didn't need to engage in complex analysis. He merely needed to highlight the inherent absurdity of the situation. The specific details, the culinary publication, the precise genetic fractions, the formal tribal rejection were uniquely resistant to serious defense. The undeniable physical evidence of the handwritten document functioned as an inescapable anchor to the controversy. In the aftermath, a representative from the affected tribal nation issued a profound statement that largely evaded mainstream political coverage. They asserted that neither political figure adequately represented their interests. One had opportunistically adopted their heritage before discarding it, while the other utilized their historical trauma as a comedic tool. They emphasized their enduring sovereignty and presence as 700,000 citizens, predating and destined to outlast both political entities. This vital perspective vanished into the overwhelming noise of the digital landscape, overshadowed entirely by the viral repetition of the cookbook's title. The executive's effectiveness did not stem merely from aggressive tactics, but from a calculated precision. Every nickname and seemingly spontaneous remark ultimately reinforced his central thesis, a prolonged history of inauthentic representation. He understood that while a political profile might survive rigorous journalistic scrutiny and formal apologies by relying on contextual nuance, it struggles to survive being reduced to a punchline. Humor effectively strips away complexity, leaving only the most absurd elements exposed. The concept of an academic submitting unoriginal recipes to a culturally specific publication under a disputed identity was, in the unforgiving arena of modern political discourse, irreversibly damaging. The following morning at 6:07 a.m., as the senator traveled toward the Capitol, she focused on drafting highly technical correspondence designed to compel regulatory compliance involving 83 statutory obligations, a testament to her enduring commitment to the incremental processes of governance. This vital, complex work would influence legal proceedings and protect consumers, yet it would remain largely invisible to the wider public, entirely eclipsed by the pervasive digital echo of her opponent's rhetorical strikes. She continued to formulate intricate strategies, as was her nature, navigating the harsh reality that certain historical actions produce enduring narratives that no amount of subsequent planning can easily dismantle. Meanwhile, in a rural community located within Cherokee County, population 48,000, possessing a median household income of $38,000, a citizen with legitimate documentation, and undeniable ancestral ties to the historical tragedies frequently invoked in these political debates, remained entirely disconnected from the televised spectacle. Working a demanding shift at a local commercial establishment, her perspective was ignored by the major media apparatuses. She represented the demographic whose identity was constantly being contested, yet whose voice was consistently excluded from the conversation. She would eventually learn of the controversy, experiencing the familiar, weary resignation of seeing her heritage simultaneously appropriated for political advancement and utilized as a weaponized joke. She would then return to her daily responsibilities, embodying the enduring resilience of a community that had survived profound historical injustices and would continue to endure long after the current political figures had faded from prominence.